Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. Today, I'm so excited to announce that we'll be beginning a new series, Speak Freely, where once a month, we'll be bringing you discussions about campus free speech right here from the heart of Princeton University. We'll be kicking off this series with a discussion of the Princeton Principles for a Campus Culture of Free Inquiry, a set of principles meant to revitalize free speech on campus, which goes beyond the well-known Chicago principles. This document is the result of a meeting here at the Madison program in March of 2023. Here to discuss, we have two of the original 15 signers of the statement who are really key in pulling the statement together. Professor Emeritus Donald Downs of the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Professor Keith Whittington, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics here at Princeton, although he's just announced that he'll soon be moving to Yale. Keith, you'll be very missed. As your host for the day, I'm very excited to introduce my colleague, Jonathan Garaffa, who works really closely with our initiative on freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression. He's done so much work on the Princeton Principles, and he's going to be a really able guide for today's discussion. So, with no further ado, I hope you enjoy.
Keith and Don, welcome to Madison's Notes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, first, I just want to ask you the grounding question. What are the Princeton Principles, and why should we care about this document? I'll start with Don, because Don was one of the primary writers.
Right, along with a lot of input, put it that way.
Yeah.
Definitely a kind of joint effort. And I think Keith and I will pretty much say the same thing here. University, it's a lot of things go on, especially in the modern university. And so what really matters is what has traditionally mattered. It's a special institution for teaching information and knowledge, but pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of truth, which is sort of a little bit different from knowledge, because knowledge is our ability to understand truth. And that's really the primary function of it. But also to teach is kind of a balance, because you can't get to truth unless you have enough intellectual freedom and academic freedom, because human beings are fallible, because truth can often be very complicated. We change our minds all the time over different things we take to be true. And so there has to be intellectual freedom that goes along with it. But freedom can go anywhere. You can believe 2 and 2 is 5. As a matter of fact, it's even protected by the First Amendment. So university pursues truth in a certain way, a disciplined kind of way, that we try to have academic freedom for everybody, but also sift and winnow. It's a motto from Wisconsin. Sift and winnow to get to the truth. What is true, what is not true. At the same time, we appreciate the fact that we may never fully get there. We have to be open in the mind, open to the possibility that we could be wrong. So the university should be in the business of not only seeking truth and knowledge, but teaching the skills that are necessary to properly sift and winnow and separate truth from falsehood.
Mm-hmm.
Balance. And the best universities are able to do that.
And so, going along with that, I'm going to ask another grounding question here. What is the core mission of the university? And you mentioned it a little bit, but I think that's something that we should be really clear on as a first principle.
Right. Yeah, the pursuit of truth and knowledge, and the skills necessary to carry that out. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really at the very heart of it. I mean, universities have expanded in what they try to do. They do other things, but the very central element of their mission, the real purpose of universities in general, is to try to advance the frontiers of human knowledge, to be able to share what we know with the wider community, with the students, with other scholars in the field more generally. And so that process of asking hard questions, trying to assess what the quality of evidence and arguments analysis that we might have available to us to help us answer those questions, subject our conventional wisdom to new skepticism, new criticism. It's all, I think, the central things universities can do. And while we may add on some additional features that we would like universities to do as well, at the end of the day, they all need to be compatible with that core mission, because it's that core mission that really defines universities and make them special.
Mm-hmm. And I think it does also entail creating the kind of habits, intellectual habits and emotional habits, to have due respect for differences of opinion, because those will A, naturally arise, and B, sometimes we're wrong. So it's a certain kind of character that should be instilled that is necessary for the process that Keith talked about to prevail.
Mm-hmm. So, Keith, you mentioned in your book that one of J.S. Mill's arguments for having free speech is the argument from ignorance. Basically, well, there's argument from conviction, argument from ignorance, and argument from humility. The argument from humility is that we have to have a healthy distance from our opinions because there's a possibility we could be wrong. And so is that something that all scholars should see as a model? Not just scholars, but anyone participating in the university?
I think it's essential. At the end of the day, as scholars, you wind up developing arguments and ideas that you believe in. You have some fair amount of confidence in them. You dedicate portions of your scholarly career to trying to develop them and articulate them and determine what kind of evidence is supportive of them. But despite how much work you put into them and how closely you may be associated with particular ideas, it's at the very core of the scholarly mission to leave yourself open to the possibility you're still wrong. And that means in part that you need to take seriously criticisms and need to be willing to engage them and not just dismiss them. But also you have to have, I think, a genuine humility of imagining that even though you've made your best efforts, even though you've come to certain conclusions, those conclusions all have to be tentative. They all have to be able to be criticized, but potentially reassessed. And if you discover at the end of the day that the arguments and evidence point in a different direction, you have to be willing to change your mind and try to follow the arguments and evidence where they lead. That's a hard thing to do. It's hard for all of us to do it, I think, in our personal lives. It can be particularly tricky in some ways for a scholar who may have dedicated their entire career to trying to develop a particular idea precisely because they thought it was true and that there was good support for it. And so that's a temptation to start getting defensive about it and wanting to protect what you've been doing all this time and really sort of dig in defense of it. But no matter how much time and effort you put into a set of arguments, no matter how closely you're associated with them publicly, it's still the case that the scholarly state of mind ought to be one in which you're holding open that possibility that you could have been mistaken, and you're willing to listen to people who want to bring you criticisms and new ideas and new evidence you ought to be taking seriously and trying to think through.
Absolutely. Right on. And, it's so hard to do that, as Keith said. You study the history of science. You study the history of knowledge. And, when Kuhn got into this in his book on the scientific revolutions, we get committed to paradigms, and they define our careers and our prestige. And challenges, there's been recent books written about challenges to existing paradigms in science and how difficult it can be because there's a lot of stake, and people are driven by ambition. This ties. Think about our Constitution, and then think of Jonathan Rauch and Constitution of Knowledge. That the Constitution was sort of premised on the idea that we're driven by ambition, and we need to have a republic that is able to accommodate that because that's part of liberty. But at the same time, there's a downside to that because it can blind us to the truth. It can tie us to our passions. We end up having committed to our tribe rather than to the public good. And our Constitution was a device meant to try to preserve liberty while also dealing with those downsides of liberty. And the university is very similar. And so either you inculcate that kind of character of mind, or Keith called it the academic mindset, or you have somebody that is a referee to help guarantee that. And those kinds of bodies, I think, are missing in higher education. We're going to get to that in a moment. Uh, so, how do you pursue the truth with human interest and passion? It's a really interesting question, and it's ultimately a philosophical question.
Yeah, and Don brings up the science and Kuhn. There's an old joke in the sciences: how do scientific revolutions proceed? And the answer is one funeral at a time, precisely because old scientists who are committed to the old ideas may be very reluctant to change their minds. It's ultimately up to the younger scholars and younger generations that emerge who are open to the new ideas, take the new ideas and run with them. And ultimately, the older commitments, older generations sort of die away as it gets taken over by the younger generation. There's some truth in that. I think it's a reality that individuals may not always remain open-minded over time, and so they may be resistant to themselves embracing the new ideas. But it also highlights one of the things that's really essential about academia as an institution, that it can't allow those individuals who may be reluctant to take on the new ideas, very defensive about the old ideas, to then try to suppress the debate so their students and their younger colleagues can't be exposed to those new ideas, and so they can't adopt new ideas, right? Because not only is there a temptation for you yourself to become very defensive and unwilling to change, but if you have any influence, there's also a temptation to not allow other people to really take seriously those criticisms and really try to suppress the debate. And so when there are these big sweeping changes in a set of ideas that are terribly important in a particular scientific discipline, for example, it's not only the case that individuals ought to try to keep themselves open-minded, but it's really, really essential that the institutions remain open to challenge and new ideas. We not allow anybody to try to shut down those debates out of fear that somebody else is going to be persuaded by them.
And that gets to the question of intellectual diversity on campus, which will certainly come up at some point in our discussion. Because if you're surrounded by people that might disagree, then disagreement becomes more institutionalized and part of your habit. But if you're surrounded by people in a kind of echo chamber, it's like a fish that doesn't know it's in water, because this is the obvious truth. But an irony here, coming off of what Keith said, and I think Mill gets at this pretty well in On Liberty, is that the paradox is that it was the very ambition that compelled many scientists, for example, to create new paradigms. It's like an agonistic struggle between generations, or however you want to put it. That very ambition, which got them to develop a new truth. Apparently a biography of Copernicus talking about when he developed his ideas, he felt like he was challenging God. And Mill actually praises that type of person, right? It's his model. But at the same time, that's a very type of personality that once you find what you think is truth, it's going to close you off. And so, how do you deal then with intellectual ambition? You have to have these kind of guardrails. And I think, the Princeton principles is really something we tried to get at, was create the right kind of guardrails to ameliorate, to foster that kind of ambition. At the same time, you make it kind of sublimate itself or be more reflective. And it's a constant job because the gravity is in favor of the human nature that doesn't want to be that way. And that's why democracy is a constant struggle.
Right. It kind of wants to be content with the ideas that have been pushed forward currently, a sort of an orthodoxy, if you will. And I wanted to touch a little bit on the principles' history, because I know that there was a really influential document that, on first glance, says a lot of some of the same things. So the principles refers to the Chicago Principles of Free Expression in its introduction. And these principles argued, quote, the Chicago Principles of Free Expression, 2014, argued that universities should remain committed to free, robust, and uninhibited debate and deliberation. The Princeton Principles for a Campus Culture of Free Inquiry affirm this view while extending its scope, unquote. So my question to you is, considering the groundwork we've laid already, what is the difference in scope between the 2014 Chicago Principles of Free Expression and the recently released Princeton Principles? And why was there a need to release a new set of principles? What new ground does the Princeton Principles cover that previous documents have not?
Okay. Well, Keith, you gave it to me the first time. I'll give it to you this time.
Yeah, so I think in part the Princeton principles are more encompassing about what it's trying to do. What the Chicago principles drafted a few years ago was really focused on is questions of free expression on the campus broadly, which in part is interesting in that it tries to not only emphasize the role of faculty, but also everybody else as part of the campus community and the importance of them having the ability to discuss ideas without fear of retribution, retaliation for controversial ideas they might express. That's an important principle of universities, but it's only, I think, one of the things that you would ultimately want to have if you want to secure a university as being a effective institution that's really committed to free inquiry. So part of what the Princeton Principles is doing, I think, is really trying to bring together a lot of different components of what we might think of as kind of comprehensive free inquiry set of commitments in a university. I think also the details of the Princeton Principles are somewhat distinctive in that, as Don mentioned, they take into account how universities have changed over time. So there have been very influential statements about academic freedom that were drafted in the early 20th century. For example, we see the Calvin Report about institutional neutrality that was drafted at the University of Chicago in the early 1970s. But a lot has changed since the 1970s, let alone the early 20th century. Universities look very different. There's a much more complicated organizational environment inside of universities, a lot more people with different kinds of roles and positions in universities than once was the case. And so I think the principles do a nice job of securing the same firm commitments that you see in some of these earlier documents, but extending the logic and reach of them to incorporate the wider array of things that you see on a modern university campus.
Right. Yeah, that thing sums it up very well. We deal with the culture. And let me start by, the Chicago principles were fantastic. And, Jeffrey Stone, a law professor at Chicago, who was the principal author of that, he's been a real champion in terms of both scholarship and in terms of his activities to promote freedom, intellectual freedom and civil liberty in America. I mean, it was a first-rate project. And we applaud the Chicago principles. But we delve into the culture. And that includes different, as Keith mentioned, different domains on campus, the classroom, the public forum, extramural speech, and things like that. And also, obligations of the administration. And we deal with the bureaucratic problem, which I'm sure we'll be talking about, because my view is the university's been turned upside down. For a university to work, faculty have to be the key drivers. We shouldn't be we're not like kings or queens, but we should be the key driver, because we're the experts and we're the ones who are supposedly knowledgeable about all the principles. But with the new bureaucratic situation on campus, it's been turned up to one off-the-cuff student complaint goes to the bureaucracy, and it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to get dragged in to the DEI office and interrogated. And so there's a pall of orthodoxy that can be spread over the campus. We get into that kind of stuff, and we also talk about some of the problems that have created this situation in the first place. So we just, as Keith said, we dig deeper, I think, than Chicago does. And also, since Chicago came out, there's schools that adopted the Chicago principles that have come up as problem cases in the Academic Freedom Alliance. So, it's easy to pay lip service to something. We're asking people institutions to show more than just lip service. So we extend Chicago. But, without Chicago, we may not have even come about in the first place.
Sure. And I'd like to note Princeton University has adopted the Chicago principles,
right,
for in case our listeners didn't know that.
So did Wisconsin. The whole system was adopted here. But it also matters how you adopt it. I mean, Chicago, they went through the faculty, I think, right? Here, it was done by the regents. It never was put before the faculty. And there are a set of reasons for that I won't get into, but that does mean that if it goes through the institution, that's usually a sounder basis, because it's derived some consent on campus, and people have had to agree to it, as opposed to just having it sort of issued from on high.
Right.
In Princeton's case, because it occurred through a faculty vote, it also became incorporated into our governing rules and regulations for the university, and so it has binding consequences for how the university operates, which is not always
Yeah.
true. So some places have adopted it more as a symbolic resolution. That's important. It helps establish a culture and encourage the nurturing of a culture committed to free expression. But at the end of the day, you also want some real rules in place that can constrain how administrators and others behave, something you can appeal to in the
Yep.
context of disciplinary hearings and other things. And so I think there was a lot of value in trying to not make this purely symbolic at a place like Princeton, but really make this part of the functioning of the university.
Right. And that's the case here at Madison, because what we did, we've been doing this stuff now for almost 30 years. And a lot of what went into the Wisconsin systems statement based on Chicago was drawn from rules that we have here on our own campus. So in that sense, we did it from the bottom up here, but the system adopting the Chicago principles, that was from the top down.
And if folks want to refer to the actual, you call it legislation within Princeton, I believe it's rights, rules, and responsibilities section 1.1.3 and part of 1.1.4, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So our governing document is called Rights, Rules, and Responsibilities. It's available online and is publicly accessible. The principles contained in the Chicago Statement were integrated right at the top of the Rights, Rules, and Responsibilities, which is symbolically nice, and so reflecting that it really is a foundation stone for the whole university.
Yeah, same thing here.
I'm going to continue with the Princeton principles, just looking at the introduction, continuing on by describing the part that describes a special fiduciary duty. So that's kind of a fancy word, fiduciary, but I looked it up and it says, in the dictionary, it says involving trust. So could you describe the trust between universities and the public, and this phrasing, special fiduciary duty, how does that underscore the responsibilities of the university in our society?
I'll start this round. I, three reasons, I think. I hope I remember all three. One is that universities have historically served society. They're not just they're there for a reason. And just so that you go back to the history of the reading founding documents and things like that, and Keystone, a lot of that, they all talk about that service. And the original presidents and chancellors, whatever, they talked about the public service aspect of the university. And related to that, there was this is the second point, is a special kind of duty. Because going back to our original discussion, we are the preeminent institution that is there to pursue truth and knowledge and to instill the intellectual virtues that make that quest possible. And that in turn creates better citizens for our society, more thoughtful citizens, citizens who are more likely to weigh pros and cons. And I think sort of a lot of writers did this, and I've done it myself in writing, that maybe the model for this is the jury. When you're in a criminal trial and you're picked as a juror, or a civil trial, criminal makes it more dramatic. Your job is to leave your prejudices at the door, and that you're trying to determine what happened and whether or not the defendant is culpable. And it doesn't matter whether you like that defendant or you don't like that defendant. You need to think as objectively as possible about the situation, and that makes your decision just. And so there's not a tension, but a relationship between what a university's mission is and truth, and the pursuit of truth and respect for that pursuit, and the viability of a constitutional democracy. That's how I look at it. And then three, it's also that in some ways, the autonomy that we've been granted as an institution in our charters, and especially this applies to state universities, but it can also apply to private universities depending on how they were set themselves up and what's in their charters. And that is that we've been given basic autonomy to determine for ourselves core academic decisions, to put it just briefly. And in exchange for that, it has been assumed that we will fulfill that particular fiduciary duty. And in that, do we have other duties? We do, but that is the key one. And that's what makes us distinct from, say, the Salvation Army or a political party or some other kind of institutions. Each major institution has its own distinctive reason for existing. And ours is what we've already articulated: pursuit of truth and knowledge through intellectual freedom, and creating the habits of mind that make that quest possible and therefore contribute to citizenship in a constitutional republic. And if we don't prioritize that as our major mission and then stick to it when the going gets tough and some group gets mad at us for allowing something to be said, then we're letting down society and we're not fulfilling our end of the bargain. We can expect society at some point to come back and say, wait a minute, we're giving you all this money, or all these donors are giving you money, and you're not fulfilling the reason we're giving you the money.
And do you happen to have an example of a time when that happened?
Well, it's right now, not the cancel culture on campus. It's, the primary example, and we can think the dozens of such examples going on all the time, and the AFA has dealt with many individual cases in that regard. So that would be a major one. I think I would say during the McCarthy period, of course that was on the side of the government was pushing that, so it's a recurring kind of problem. But anytime the free speech has been denied on campus, or take Middlebury and Charles Murray is just maybe the most dramatic example, then that university is not fulfilling its duty. It's letting angry students take over the mission of the university, and it's not standing up to the plate and doing its job.
Now, I remember I read Keith's book to also supplement my preparation, and I remember Keith describes how the relationship between a professor and the university is not like any other employer-employee relationship, in the sense that the professor is given certain rights and privileges to follow the research where it is supposed to go, and is supposed to be allowed to say things that might even conflict with the university's branding, so to say, and that's different from I guess a standard employer-employee relationship, that someone who speaks against their employer or questions the practices of the employer could theoretically face some retribution for that. So could you describe a little bit more, why is free speech and academic freedom so important in relation to the special privileges of a professor, faculty member?
Yeah, so it's a central argument that the American Association of University Professors was trying to advance in the early 20th century when they were first organized, that universities should not simply think of the members of the faculty as mouthpieces for the views and opinions of, in particular, the donors who made up the board trustees who were contributing to universities in particular. So especially in the context of private universities, it was very common for people who are coming in from different kinds of industries to be serving as trustees and the like, and have an expectation that if they found an employee of what they thought of as their university who was behaving in ways that they didn't approve of, spouting opinions that they thought were harmful to their own personal interest, that you ought to get rid of that person in order to clean up your own organization. So it was a hard-won fight to try to persuade trustees and donors to think differently about universities, to think of university faculty as being differently situated than would be true of employees at lots of other organizations and businesses, and that the job of the faculty ultimately was not to reinforce the particular perspectives and views of influential figures at the university, but to pursue the truth as best they could, and that you therefore had to give faculty a significant amount of freedom and independence to be able to develop those ideas, articulate those ideas, to teach those ideas, and you had to persuade universities as institutions, university presidents, and trustees to tolerate faculty who express ideas that the trustees find to be wrongheaded, or that they disagree with, or that they think are hurtful to their own interest or even to the university particularly. And it goes back to this notion that there's a fiduciary duty that universities ultimately have to perform for society more generally. The point of the university as an institution is to engage in truth seeking, and we can't allow particular individuals associated with the university to pervert that mission in order to try to redirect it away from free inquiry toward the truth and toward certain kinds of favorite opinions. That's true at the institutional level. And one implication of that is there's a similar duty and responsibility on the part of the faculty to tell the truth as best you can. And then you need a freedom from the university that will tolerate and allow you to express that truth. But it's important, I think I like the language of fiduciary duties in part because it does emphasize the extent to which this isn't just a discretionary act. It's not just a matter of freedom. Ultimately, it's a responsibility. It's a duty that the university owes to society, that faculty owe to their profession, to their students, to their colleagues, and to ultimately to society as well. And so I think it's easy to lose sight of that, to get so caught up in your own sort of personal interest and battles and preferences. It's easy to forget the fact that you actually do owe something for all of the privileges that you have as an academic, and part of what you owe is the willingness to be open-minded, the willingness to help build an institution that is open to free inquiry, the willingness to tolerate people with divergent ideas, a willingness to engage in critical analysis and discussion with people with divergent ideas and not simply try to shut them down, and then a willingness to speak the truth as best you can, even when it's hard, even when you're going to have pressure and pushback and it's unpopular in various ways, that nonetheless, it's ultimately the responsibility of academics to be willing to stand up and say, look, I know this is not the common view. I know others are going to have heated disagreements, but this is what I see as being true about these circumstances, and to articulate it. And if we're not willing to do that, and we're not willing to nurture an institution that will support us in doing that, that we really are perverting the mission of the university and ultimately falling down on the responsibility that we have to society more generally.
So that when Jonathan asked me about examples, that would be a key example, is faculty not standing up when they should. And you go back to the AUP in the 1915 statement on academic freedom and tenure, they talk about the duty, the kind of character of a faculty member to be able to stand up to the conventional view and challenge it if that's what he or she believes to be true. And we think the Princeton principles, you talk about this, how one reason we got to where we got is faculty has let it happen. So that would be another example. But a very quick point too, that it seems counterintuitive to the average person. We have tenure protections, and when we were able to have them, now that's less than half of the teaching positions have tenure. And we have this special privilege. You can criticize your institution if the institution is abiding by the conditions that Keith has articulated. You can criticize your institution, or try that in the fire department.
Sure.
Try that in a corporation, right? And so people say, well, who do you think you are to have this? And we've run into that here in a couple of very difficult cases where we had to take a stance in favor of academic freedom when the person was a real scoundrel, but the administration totally misbehaved in how they dealt with it. It's a tough thing to get across. But if we don't give faculty that freedom, then we can't carry out our fiduciary duty. So it's incumbent upon us then to abide by that faculty right, but also to educate people as to why we need it. And I think we've failed in that for a variety of reasons, partly because we're so busy with other stuff, and maybe we assume that the public's going to catch on. But I love the way Keith put it. It's not just a right, it's a duty. And it's a duty. You notice a duty when you feel like you should say something, but you're afraid to. And you don't live up to your duty. That's what a duty is, something that's generally often hard to do, right? This can be hard. And if the public says, oh, there's just another faculty member spouting off, they don't feel any sense of responsibility. The fact is they might be feeling the highest sense of responsibility, depending on the circumstance.
So I want to continue to talk about something else that the Princeton Principles addresses, which is today it's a pretty hot button issue, is extramural speech. And so extramural speech is basically when a faculty member speaks on social media or somewhere like outside of the classroom. And so the Princeton Principles state venues where free speech should obtain include public forums and lectures, social media, and the kaleidoscopic multitude of everyday interchanges that enliven campus life, unquote. So this seems like another new piece of territory that Princeton Principles addresses. So how does the Princeton Principles address the idea of extramural speech in a way that previous documents don't?
Well, Keith is the extramural expert. I'll let him start again on this one.
So it's an interesting question about how it does it in ways that others don't. I think it's certainly more detailed than what you would see in lots of other discussions about it, and emphasizes how many people in the university ought to be able to enjoy that kind of freedom to be able to express their personal views in public without worrying that their employer is going to retaliate against them if those views are unpopular. This is a very long-standing feature of the academic freedom debate in the United States. The AAUP, when it was first articulating principles of academic freedom, included this. There was some debate within the association at its founding as to whether or not this was something that ought to be protected, because it's certainly very different than the kinds of protections that are necessary for teaching and for research. But ultimately, the AUP settled on thinking that this was an important thing to protect as well. And I think we've seen lots of examples of why it's actually essential that you be able to protect this kind of extramural speech. And so just to put out sort of two kinds of examples that are quite different, but and they show the range, I think, of extramural speeches that occur. So one, you can imagine a professor going into public to talk about their research interests, to try to share their expertise with the public more generally. It's part of what we want faculty to be doing. That part, again, to go back to this sort of idea of there's a public trust that you're trying to serve as an academic. Part of what you're doing is developing a kind of expertise in a subject matter. And when that expertise is relevant to things that are happening in public and political debates, you want faculty to be able to share that expertise in order to try to inform the public, inform policymakers about what we know on that particular topic. But that expertise can sometimes be controversial, and it may well be that people don't care very much if you're doing it in scholarly monographs that only other academics are reading, or you're doing it in the classroom that not very many people are seeing. But the first time you go out in public and start talking about it, suddenly you might wind up with a lot of pushback. And so if we don't protect the ability of people to go out into public and talk about their scholarly ideas, ultimately we're not doing a very good job protecting the scholarly ideas themselves, and we're not fulfilling our duty to try to share expertise with the public more generally, which is the ultimate point of what we're trying to do more broadly. The other kind of example, though, is quite different, and I think in some ways not as obvious as to why you'd want to defend it, which is imagine going out in public and talking about things you have no particular expertise about, but instead they're just matters of your own personal opinion. Everybody on campus has their own particular political views. Those personal political views may not have anything to do with this kind of scholarly research that people are engaged in. And yet, these sort of core principles of protecting extramural speech say that universities likewise should be protective of that and should not punish people for expressing controversial political views off campus. I think that if you don't do a good job of protecting even that, it will ultimately back up on those core scholarly concerns that we're most concerned about. And so I think there's not a first order reason for wanting to defend faculty who simply are expressing personal political opinions in public. But if we don't do a good job of protecting that, if we set up the kind of mechanisms for censoring that kind of speech and monitoring that kind of speech as well, it will eventually encroach on our ability to talk about the core scholarly expertise that we have in a larger public arena. So I think it's critical for universities to draw a very bright line to simply say that we're not going to punish members of our campus for expressing controversial things in public. Part of what universities are committed to is the development and expression of controversial ideas. And when people out in the world encounter that feature of universities, it's critical universities are willing to stand up and say, that's a feature, and we're going to protect it, and we're going to maintain it. We're not going to punish people for expressing themselves in this way.
I think that's exactly right. I like how Keith distinguishes first order and second order normatively, but then in terms of policy, there should be the same kind of bright line. And you think of just recently with the Israeli crisis, and the teacher at Cornell went out there and very strongly cheered Hamas on in language, which meant they agreed with their tactics and their ideology of exterminating Israel. And all the shouts to fire him. Apparently, there's 11,000 people signed a petition. That's an example of extreme. But it was an area that he was a scholar in, if I recall. I think that's right. He knows something about the issue. And then you have the case of women at UC Davis who actually made sort of more generally threatening comments about people that covered that crisis in the wrong way. It was very extreme, approaching being kind of a threat. And I think we still determined whether or not it crossed that line or not. And a threat is not protected speech. We have a whole section on that in the Princeton Principles, pretty much drawn from Chicago. And those are very controversial. But then, how do you draw the line? Now, the John Wilson, who is one of the main writers for the AAUPs, one of their academic freedom advisors and everything, long history. And I'm sure Keith's had encounters with him, and I have too over the past. And I shouldn't say encounters, because even though we've often disagreed, it was always very collegial. And John and I go way back, and he wrote a strong critique of the Princeton Principles on 3 grounds. And one was the extramural speech thing, because we conclude that you should never punish or sanction someone for their extramural speech as long as it's protected. And that would include even considerations of the advancement, raises, you name it. And he said, well, it's not really possible for that to exist in the real world, because sometimes people say things are just so outrageous. You shouldn't even want them on the campus. And my reply to that was, I said, admit this is the one area in the Princeton Principles where reasonable differences are more likely to occur. And I said, we took a more libertarian position because, for reasons that Keith articulated, that we just don't know if you don't draw the line in protecting it, then where else can you draw it? It is really slippery slope arguments sometimes are overdone, but it seems, given our experiences, and a lot of what went into the Princeton Principles wasn't just based on studying and reading history and all that. People in that room have had experience in this battle on campus for a long time. So experience informs your position as well as your knowledge. That drawing the line there is exceedingly difficult. So we decided to err on the side of liberty in this area. And we also went on and made a further comment that the university um, should not criticize what someone says in extramural speech in a way which turns that person into a pariah.
Right.
And I think that was sort of controversial too, but I think it's very important because part of the problem we're dealing with is not simply the bad rules that are applied or good rules that are applied badly, but the culture and people becoming pariahs for things they say that are unpopular.
Yeah.
And that's a real concern because that silences. And Greg Lukianoff and his co-author Shad, I guess her name is, a young woman student who was with an intern for Fire, have a new book out, and that's really one. I haven't read it yet, but I've talked to Greg about it, and I've read reviews already. I've ordered it. Is that it's the culture, it's the silencing that goes to people that are afraid to speak up, and so you have. Because the other groups, more vocal groups, dominate. And if you say something politically incorrect, then you're going to be a pariah, you're going to get bullied online or what have you. That's where the real problem is.
And I want to cut in here. So we've spoken a lot about how faculty should speak and speak freely. Could you speak a little bit to? You've already touched on it a bit, but how should institutions speak or not speak? What is institutional neutrality? I know we're coming up on time, but maybe you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, especially today, right? How do you respond to the Israeli crisis?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah.
We would stick by our guns. It's similar to what we've been talking about. In some ways, we've been talking about both extramural speech and the university being neutral.
Yeah.
Because the university is not neutral. It creates pariahs. It sort of says, here's the right way to think about something, and it stacks the deck on controversial issues. And so the preferred position is institutional neutrality, unless it's something that directly affects the operation of the university itself. And so taking a position on the war in Ukraine would be an example. Why do that? It's not part of the operation of the university. A very important issue, don't get me wrong, and I care a lot about it, but that's not the institution's role. And I think the problem you're seeing with these statements that are being made by the university now, or those who are taking a neutral position, is that they didn't do it in the past. So it's looking like they're hypocritical. And in some ways, some people say, well, doesn't this new crisis show that you're wrong in adopting the Calvin type principle for the Princeton principles? In my view, it affirms what we did, because the reason this has become controversial is because universities now, suddenly you're not talking about this horrible case that happened.
Yeah.
And before you talked about everything under the sun, So I think it's the right position because it's consistent with everything we've been talking about. And the university has to use judgment in doing it. Sometimes it's going to be a difficult decision, and sometimes they might take a position when they shouldn't. But the key is to keep this principle in mind when you're making that decision.
I just wanted to mention how the Princeton principles phrase it, because it's stuck in my mind. In some, if an academic institution is not required to adopt a position in order to fulfill its mission of intellectual freedom or operational capacity, it is required not to adopt a position. I think that was a pretty succinct summary of institutional neutrality, no? Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. And so I wanted to give you one last question. I know we're coming up on time, but I want to give you guys a chance to address a part of the principles that some of the media coverage of the Princeton principles has addressed. So the principles do mention that government intervention may be considered, quote, as a last resort, unquote, to defend free speech and academic freedom. And I'll read a more precise wording here. So the document Princeton principles state, quote, governments, along with trustees and regents, may legitimately prohibit speech codes and related policies that inhibit or punish speech protected by free speech, jurisprudence, and academic freedom, unquote. So can you elaborate on the conditions that would be necessary before this last resort of government intervention is opened as a possibility, and what other means would have to be exhausted before this possibility comes into play?
Yeah, we gave a lot of. This was the last thing we talked about, and I wanted to make sure that it was a limited thing, and that
Yeah.
if there's any kind of involvement from outside, it has to be for positive reasons, expanding. And government's done that in so many other areas, right? Harassment laws and uh, other kinds of non-discrimination laws that come from outside the university. The universities were very sympathetic to them in the first place. These are government mandates. And so we're talking about a government mandate for free speech, if indeed it is necessary. Back in 2000 and roughly 2002 or three, Alan Kors, who's one of the signers of our document and a big contributor to what we did, and of course I consider him the godfather of academic freedom and intellectual freedom on campus. He got influenced the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights within it to pass a regulation. I think it had the status of regulation. I don't know, Keith might know more about this, but to state, where it was one of these letters to universities, that in applying your harassment laws or policies and any other policy, you must abide by First Amendment principles. And so that it was something from the Department of Education that applied to universities. And I didn't hear anybody raising major concerns about that. So those are the kinds of conditions that we would endorse. And if a university situation was such that cancel culture was the norm and speakers are getting shouted down, et cetera, there are certain anecdotes or certain events that could raise an alarm. Or you could do a survey, which we've done in the University of Wisconsin system, that deals with to sort of try to get at the reluctance of students to speak their minds honestly and freely. And that showed that there was a lot of that happening. FIRE has done similar kinds of surveys. A problem I see in the politics of this is that often you read about something that happened at one school and you assume it's happening at this other school, and therefore we're going to get outside intervention in this other school, even though there's no evidence to justify it. And as I've written, higher education is we got 4,000 institutions, 5,000 institutions, depending on how you define them. There's all sorts of cases where things are going well. There's cases where they're not. There's cases where it's sort of gray. And so what the document, and this is only at the end of the document, it's the least thorough part of it. But the assumption why there is this sort of bar of clear and convincing evidence is that you need some evidence to justify it when you do it. And then when you do it, you got to be really careful because of the history of outside intervention. The principle of autonomy matters. And then you have to have some real basis for doing it. And when you do it, it should only be to make sure that there's more speech, not less. And I think that's a pretty reasonable position when all is said and done, unless some state government takes it as a mandate to run off and do something ridiculous. And we criticized what happened in Florida in a couple incidents. I mean, Keith's written about this in Law Review, a great Law Review piece about the divisive concepts principle. We take that on in the document. So there's a role if you expand, if you help the problem, rather than be negative. So I think that's it's meant to be purely constructive and limited to an evidence-based kind of situation.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's a range of views among those of us who are involved in the project about how healthy the free inquiry culture is on university campuses and what might be necessary in order to try to improve it. I think Don and I both are still somewhat optimistic about universities and their ability to self-reform. There are others who might be more skeptical of that. I think that's important to remind those who might be tempted to intervene in universities that sometimes medicine is worse than the disease, that you, if you're not careful, you make the situation worse, or you may simply change the valence of the limitations on free inquiry on campus, but you don't actually improve the possibility of free inquiry on campus. And so I think these institutions are extraordinarily delicate. I think outside intervention is almost never helpful. And it's important to remind those who are outside of campus that that's true, and that they ought to be extremely reluctant to try to intervene. At the same time, I think it's also extraordinarily important to remind those of us who are on campus, to go back to our earlier point, that they have a responsibility and duty, that we've made a bargain with society, with trustees, with governments, about what it is we're trying to do on universities. And if we don't live up to that bargain, we should expect that there's going to be outside intervention at the end of the day. And people who are in the positions of trustees, of regents of public universities, they also have a legal obligation to ensure that universities are living up to their mission. And so it's derelict of their own responsibility if trustees look at their university and say, and think, we're not actually doing what we're supposed to be doing here, and then shrug their shoulders and ignore it. And so given that they have that obligation also, I think it's particularly important for those of us on campus to remember that other people are involved in this process. Other people have their own responsibilities. And our job fundamentally is to make sure that we're living up to the mission of the university so that there is no good justification for outsiders to want to intervene. And when there are questions raised about how good of a job we're doing, we need to be able to have an honest conversation about whether or not we're doing a good job. We sometimes then have to look internally and think about, are there ways we ought to improve and reform the situation? And we ought to be willing to undertake that kind of institutional reform when necessary in order to make sure that we stay on the right track. So I certainly do not want to encourage political intervention. As Don mentioned, I've written a fair amount about why I think a lot of the political interventions and suggestions for political intervention that we are seeing now are taking us down on a wrong path and will make universities worse off. But I think partially the principles are designed to try to guide people toward more productive and constructive ways of trying to help the university, while reminding everybody what the core mission is, and the need for all of us to pitch in and try to make sure that we're contributing that mission in useful ways.
Yeah, we're good at circling the wagons, which is human nature. And what we want to do is the university should not become a guild. And a guild exists to perpetuate its own self-interest. And I'm afraid to say sometimes that's what we have done. And because we fought these academic, going back to McCarthyism, there are real reasons we need to be concerned about outside pressures on the university. But then what happens when we become complacent and we think we're so virtuous ourselves and so open-minded that we don't listen to criticism? It goes back to our very original discussion, the very first point that Jonathan asked. So this is part of that issue itself. But notice we spend more time talking about other groups, donors, alumni, students. We haven't talked much about students in this session. And that's happening all over the place. More student groups are getting outside funding and getting trustees and alumni and donors together. I mean, Cornell is a classic example of that. So that is happening because of the concern about this kind of thing. We got to remember, a lot of these people from outside, they care about the university, but they want it to be what it's supposed to be. And if we don't open our ears to them, as Keith has said, then we're missing an opportunity to reform ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we're not above reform. No one is above reform. And we certainly aren't.
Thank you, Don. And thank you, Keith. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us here on Madison's Notes. And we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah,
thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, there you have it, Madisonians. Professors Donald Downe and Keith Whittington on the groundbreaking Princeton principles formulated here at the Madison program. If you're interested in reading the principles, the link is in the show notes, as is the link to Professor Whittington's book, Speak Freely. I hope you enjoyed, and congratulations to Jonathan on doing such a wonderful job at his first episode here at Madison's Notes. If you want to learn more about the Madison program and what we do here on Princeton's campus, you can go to our website, jmp.princeton.edu. There, you'll be able to find not only our initiatives, including this initiative on freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression, but also the recordings of all of our lectures from the previous years and upcoming events and lectures that we'll be hosting here on Princeton's campus. You can also find us on social media, on Twitter at Madison Program, as well as on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so excited to see you next time here on Madison's Notes.